A bit over a week ago, I attended the relaunch of the Prayer Book Society of New South Wales at St Philip's Anglican Church in Sydney, the oldest Anglican parish in Australia. The event centred around a special Book of Common Prayer service, specifically the 1552 version developed by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer shortly before his martyrdom. This was followed by a talk between Dr. Mark Erngy, the head of church history at Moore Theological College, and Dr. Stephen Tong, the author of a recent work which was a central point of discussion after the service. The whole experience was fantastic and extremely relevant to my recent focus on explicating and promoting the Anglican tradition, so I thought I'd make a video recounting what happened and my reflections thereupon. And as with my recent introductory video to the Anglican Doctrine series, it gives you, my followers, something else to enjoy and chew on while I take a little bit more time to research and produce the first episode of that series on the essence of Anglicanism. One thing I want to note as well before we begin is that this video is purely my own experience and reflection and not sponsored by or speaking on behalf of the Prayer Book Society or the Sydney Diocese, although a sponsor for my channel would be nice. I did, however, acquire permission from the Prayer Book Society to use video from the event. Additionally, I will be focusing on the positive elements of the liturgy and not any criticisms I may have, which I do have, to be clear, but they were accidental to the overall experience and would prove a needless distraction. So with that said, let's begin. I first want to start with some contextual discussion. The 1552 Book of Common Prayer was, for a short period, the official liturgical form of the Church of England under King Edward VI, published in, 1552. It was developed by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, as mentioned earlier, as a revision to his own prior Book of Common Prayer from 1549. The overall form the revisions took from 1549 to 1552 was in the further removal of what were perceived as Romish elements in the English liturgy, and in their stead the establishment of practices more aligned with Reformed theology. This prayer book would not be the standard for long, as in 1553, Queen Mary would ascend the throne after the death of Edward VI, re-entering communion with Rome and beginning a restoration of Romanist ecclesiology and liturgy, during which she would put numerous reformers to death, including Thomas Cranmer. Queen Mary would die in 1558 and be succeeded by Elizabeth I, a devout Protestant, yet not as hardcore as the earlier English reformers like Cranmer. As such, in 1559, she approved a new Book of Common Prayer which reversed some of the more reformed innovations of the 1552, such as the ban on priests wearing an alb and a cope. I will link below digitized versions of both prayer books, along with a paper that discusses the differences between them for your reading pleasure. Given this context, the choice of the 1552 for the New South Wales Prayer Book Society relaunch was significant. Out of all the other books of common prayer, the 1549, the 1559, the 1604 of King James I, the 1662 under Charles II, the 1552 leans closest to the Puritan tradition, which the Sydney Diocese has held dear as of late. Now, I myself am more partial to both earlier forms and later developments that more emphasize certain aspects of traditional Catholic theology and liturgy, so I naturally would have preferred certain other liturgical features to what is present in the 1552. Nonetheless, I, and likely many others, have never experienced the 1552 liturgy, so the Prayer Book Society choosing it for the evening still gave a valuable experience, which I will now recount in some detail. The evening started with myself and a friend I met up with earlier walking to the entrance of St. Philip's, and already I was approached by young men saying they were fans of my channel, and this would occur throughout the entire evening, almost entirely young men as is expected, but one young woman as well.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
It was a bit surreal, especially as I only have a humble 7,000 subscribers, which will become 10k in no time if you subscribe today. That being the case, I met up with my friends and we took our pew seats towards the back, followed by the start of the service. I quickly realized that 19th century churches did not include Fujitsu air conditioning units, and so I began sweating buckets, as did others around me. Nonetheless, I powered through and took in the service. What I quickly noticed, even before the service, was the unusual setup at the front. The Lord's table was oriented sideways relative to the congregation, and the minister stood on one side and faced the other. Specifically, he stood on the north side of the table. This was, in fact, a major liturgical element developed in the English Reformation, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. After a short time of meeting and chatting with friends, as well as finding our seats, the bell was rung and we all stood to our feet as the clergy walked in. After this, the priest recited the Lord's Prayer and the Collect for Purity, a prayer which has deep history in Western Christendom, such as in the Mass of the Sarum Rite, a liturgy developed in England around the 11th century and was widely used until the English Reformation. Then we knelt for the saying of the Ten Commandments, wherein the priest would recite each commandment and the congregation would respond with, "Lord, have mercy upon us and incline our hearts to keep this law." I very much love this practice at the start of the liturgy, as I believe it serves two purposes. First, to cause us to consciously reaffirm our commitment to the law of God, but second, to start off the liturgy with the law that condemns us, and later juxtapose that with the gospel that saves us. Then the priest prayed 3 more collects, one for the second Sunday in Lent, another for Ash Wednesday, and another for King Charles III, at which point I'm sure any Reformed Baptists in attendance were internally screeching, "Where's Lent in the Bible?" To which I reply, Article 20, cope and seethe. After the collects, the epistolary and gospel readings were given, these being 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 verses 1 to 8 and Matthew chapter 15 verses 21 to 28, and the latter in particular would be a point of focus in the coming sermon. Then we all stood again and affirmed the Nicene Creed, a highlight of any liturgy. Similar to when we recited the 10 Commandments, the recitation of the Nicene Creed is a very important means of reinforcing the Catholic and Apostolic faith we confess as the Church. Unlike non-scripted teaching and prayer, there is almost no risk of unwittingly teaching or affirming serious error. You just repeat the carefully written formulae of the faith that you received and reflect on that. Tragically, this practice has been lost in many churches, even some so-called Anglican ones, to make room for the novelty of more authentic worship practices like the centrality of extemporaneous prayer, which has led to a malformed faith in many Christians. After the creed, we heard a sermon from the Reverend Dr. Mark Erngy, one of the ministers of the evening and the head of church history at Moore Theological College, who also appeared in the documentary I made with the Reverend River Devereaux, The Heart of Anglicanism, which you should absolutely watch if you haven't already. Reverend Erngy preached on the nature of Christ's mercy for us and our salvation by faith, using the story of Matthew chapter 15 as the key illustration. You can listen to the full sermon on the service livestream linked below, starting at the 27-minute 45-second mark. After the sermon came the lead up to the Lord's Supper, starting with the offertory, where 3 passages of Holy Scripture were read from the Gospel of Matthew, from the letter to the Galatians, and Tobit. Then we sang the offertory hymn and heard another prayer from the priest for God to receive our alms, to bring unity to the church, to save and guide all Christian rulers, clergy, and laity. After this came the preparation for Holy Communion, wherein the priest gave a relatively lengthy call to examine our hearts before receiving the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist, lest we put ourselves in danger by sinning against the body and blood. This was followed by another lengthy exhortation to come and receive the elements if we have a truly penitent heart, and for those in unrepentant sin, or just non-believers, to not receive, lest they be harmed in both soul and body. I think this section showed just how seriously the Holy Eucharist is taken even in the lower church end of the Anglican tradition, like in the 1552. It leaves no room for a merely symbolic view of the Eucharist. Rather, it is a vehicle by which we truly receive Christ's body and blood, and thus appropriate to ourselves the saving benefits of his death. And this is why the bread and wine are here called a sacrament, a sign unified with the thing it signifies. communicating through visible instruments and invisible grace. But conversely, to receive while in unrepentant sin is to open yourself up to a much greater judgment, because you are now sinning directly against the body and blood of Christ, your one hope of salvation. Following this was the general confession, wherein a representative from the congregation gave a confession of sin on behalf of the whole congregation, followed by the absolution, where the priest declares the forgiveness of God over all such sins. And shortly after this came another of the few sections where the whole congregation prays or declares something together, that being the prayer of humble access, a beautiful prayer that I encourage you to read or listen to in your own time. Finally, we came to the reception of the Eucharist, and this is where the unique layout of the Lord's table came into action. In more traditional liturgies, the altar, where the Eucharist is consecrated, is in a space called the chancel, where only the clergy and the choir can enter. This is separated by a rail from the larger space of the church called the nave, where the laity are present. At the giving of the Eucharist, the laity kneel before the altar rail and receive the bread and wine from the clergy. But in this service, the Lord's table was in the nave, allowing the laity to directly approach and kneel before the table itself to receive the Eucharist. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, the priest stands on the north side of the table where he consecrates the elements and subsequently gives them to the communicants. From some research I did on this point, I do not think we actually have direct attestation of the rationale employed by those who first introduced the North End practice of the 1552. The earliest witness of a rationale I could find comes from over a century later in a 1659 work titled The Alliance of the Divine Offices by a certain Hamon Lestrange, a detailed survey and defense of the various liturgies of England since the Reformation. At one point, he cites the manuscript collections of a learned man, that's all he says, that itself says, quote, "As for the priest standing on the north side of the table, this seemeth to avoid the fashion of the priest standing with his face towards the east, as is the popish practice." Even here, we can see that whatever text Lestrange was quoting, it too was only speculating on the rationale for the north side practice. Nonetheless, we can likely infer a partial rationale from the various writings of the English reformers on the Eucharist and against the Roman Mass. Minimally, they wanted to counter the Roman idea of a repeated immolation of Christ in the Mass by emphasizing the nature of the Eucharist as a communal meal that participates in the sufficient sacrifice of Christ for all time. Anyway, that's enough background. The receiving of the Eucharist is the pinnacle of the Christian liturgy, and it was certainly treated as such at this one. Row by row, we were ushered to the front to kneel at the table and receive the common loaf and drink from the common cup in an orderly and reverent manner. The symbolism of this partaking was incredibly rich. The laity kneeling at the Lord's table to receive the bread and the wine from the priest for our sustenance typologically reflects Christ giving his body and blood to his children. And given the unity of the sign and the things signified in a sacrament, as mentioned earlier, that also is really happening at the same time. It's not just being play acted. A proper Eucharistic ritual makes this reality visibly clear to the congregation, rather than handing out crackers and shot glasses of apple juice as many churches tragically do today. And this 1552 service did indeed communicate that reality quite well. But I will add one funny thing to this. I heard from at least one organizer of the event that they weren't sure how many people would turn up that evening, but it turned out to be quite a lot. They said around 170 in an email to us afterwards, but honestly it looked like more. But either way, so many did in fact come that the time from the first people receiving at the table to the last ones returning to their seats was half an hour. And add to this that my row was one of the first to receive. So once we got back to the seats, we were just vibing and sweating a lot. So hopefully next time they'll have a bigger table. When everyone had received the Eucharist, the service was finished up with the Lord's Prayer, a post-communion prayer, the Gloria, and a hymn before being blessed, and everyone going to a small break before the main talk. On the whole, as you could probably tell, I was pleased with this service and what it meant for the Sydney Diocese in the future, or what it means for the Sydney Diocese in the future, but I'll expand on this in just a bit. After the short break we had, we were treated to a talk between Dr. Mark Erngy and Dr. Stephen Tong, where they discussed the Reformation principles of worship as manifested in the 16th century English Reformation, with a special focus on Dr. Tong's book, Building the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer, and the Edwardian Reformation. The book was publicly launched that evening, but it was actually published back in 2023 by Brill in an ebook and a hardback format, along with the signature Brill price tag. The strong focus on the reformed dimension of Anglican theology was especially evident in this discussion, which, as mentioned at the start, makes sense in the context of the Sydney Diocese, but it also served as a great history lesson on the nature of the English Reformation, especially in the time of Thomas Cranmer and King Edward VI. They spoke on the centrality of Scripture to the 1552 liturgy, the theological input of Thomas Cranmer to that liturgy, Cranmer's ecclesiology, and more. And if you're interested, you can watch the discussion on the live stream starting at the 1 hour, 42 minute, 25 second mark. After the talk, the Right Reverend Peter Jensen, a former Archbishop of Sydney, officially launched the book in a short speech from the front. Following this, and before heading to dinner with the boys, a few books from Moore College's rare books collection were rolled out for us to look at. And this was another huge highlight of the night. These books were centuries old. So I went up and took a look myself, and though I marveled at them for a while, I wouldn't be able to adequately describe them all to you, so I'll let Dr. Mark Erngy give you the tour.
So this is a 1549 Book of Common Prayer, original. Next to it is a 1552 BCP. At the end of the table, Aaron is holding 1550 Cranmer's Treatise of True and Catholic Doctrine of the Lord's Supper. Adjacent to that is a 1662, but in the middle we have two pretty special ones. In the centre there is Richard Johnson, Reverend Richard Johnson, the first chaplain to Australia, his personal Book of Common Prayer and his personal Bible that he brought with him. And they're signed by all the visiting monarchs to Australia.
That's incredible.
Extraordinary. The man who first preached the gospel on this continent about saving good news of Jesus, there's his Bible. Incredible.
That's incredible. If you know me, you would know that I was a kid in a candy shop here, especially with that copy of Cranmer's True and Catholic Doctrine of the Lord's Supper. You may not have caught it, but that copy isn't some later reprint. It is an original first edition from 1550, from the age of Cranmer, even with some handwritten notes by its owner, not to mention the original 1549 and 1552 BCP volumes that were also there. I knew that Moore had volumes like this. In fact, I actually got to look at some and even handle some in filming The Heart of Anglicanism, but actually seeing them again, and in this case almost touching them, gave some incredible perspective, and it should give anyone great perspective. It's entirely possible that minimally they were owned by someone who knew the great Archbishop Cranmer himself. Moments like this are when history really comes to life, and for myself as an Anglican especially, it served as a monument of spiritual connection to my Anglican and even in part my ethnic heritage. Simply browsing a scan on Google Books, though incredibly useful for scholarship, cannot create that same spiritual experience. And that is my summary account of the Prayer Book Society relaunch. I want to conclude now with some reflections on what I think it means for the future of the Sydney Diocese. Many of you may have seen my video from September of last year called The Problem with Sydney Anglicanism, where I laid out some core issues I had, and still have to an extent, with the overall direction of the Sydney Diocese, chiefly with respect to its recent stripping down of her Anglican heritage. I made it to provoke a more open discussion in the diocese on the issue, which would in turn help to reverse that trend. Sure enough, not long after posting it, I learned of an effort to relaunch the Prayer Book Society of New South Wales, and I was absolutely pumped for it. Although, to be clear, I don't want to say that my video somehow caused that. I mean, And having now attended the relaunch and spoken with key figures in the organisation, I have a very high optimism for Sydney's liturgical and theological future, as more and more Anglicans, in name only, will come to learn of the heritage they possess and be persuaded to truly adopt it for themselves. Now, to state again, the flavour of the evening, and really the organisation as a whole, is firmly in the Reformed camp of Anglicanism. As I made clear, I have a preference for other traditional, if you will, Catholic forms of liturgy, such as an altar on the east wall, priests with layers of vestments, and enough incense to give an Olympic swimmer an asthma attack. And yet, even with my preference, a move to normalise traditional Reformed Anglican liturgy in the diocese is a colossal improvement on the current situation. I even told some friends at the end of the evening that if the 1552 service, as we experienced it tonight, became the minimum standard in Sydney, I'd be happy. I'd be very, very happy. And with that said, I hope that comes to pass, both because it would give more occasion for introducing even more traditional forms of Anglican liturgy in Sydney, but also because the 1552 in itself is a genuinely good form of worship. And it's because, no matter what some may say, Reformed theology and worship is an essential component of the Anglican tradition, although an essential component, I'll make that clear. One can validly debate how strong its presence is next to the Catholicity of Anglicanism, whether this or that teaching from certain Reformed authors should be adopted, but the fundamental place of Reformed theology in our, theology and worship as Anglicans cannot be denied, and coming to a proper understanding of this will lead us to a proper understanding of the Catholic foundations of Anglicanism as well. Now, I won't say more on this, as it's already a bit of a spoiler for my coming mega video, What is Anglicanism? But that is the core of my reflections on the 1552 service and what I think it means for Sydney. This really was my first foray into IRL or in real life content, and I hope to do more of these when opportunities arise, especially as they pertain to the Anglican tradition. I want to once again thank the Prayer Book Society of New South Wales for hosting this event and getting the ball rolling on positive change in Sydney. If you want to keep informed of their activities, you can follow their Facebook page at the link below. And if you want to help me keep my streak of regular, high-quality content, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and become a financial supporter on my Locals page below. But if Locals proves a little bit inconvenient, keep an eye out for another way to support me, which I'll hopefully be launching in the near future on my website, theotherpaul64.com. Thank you all very much for watching. God bless, and become Anglican.